Picture a room in China, right now, in the summer of 2026. 1,000 people are sitting in it. Some are in the room itself. Others are online, sitting in offices and living rooms hundreds of kilometers away. Every single one of them is wearing a lightweight cap covered in electrodes. And at the exact same moment, down to the millisecond, a machine starts reading their brains. Not one person's brain, not 10, 1,000, simultaneously across different cities, streaming into a single system built to make sense of it all. That is not a scene from a science fiction film. That happened at a real product launch, and the company that pulled it off says it just solved a problem that has quietly been holding back an entire industry. For years, the world's biggest AI labs have been running out of the one thing they need most: fresh, high-quality data to train the next generation of intelligence. Text has been scraped, images have been scraped, video is next. But there is a category of information no AI has ever had real access to before, and that is the raw electrical signal of a human brain actually thinking. China just built the machine that can collect that signal at a scale nobody has attempted. This is happening right now, today, in 2026, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly how it works, why it matters far beyond medicine, and why some of the same scientists celebrating this breakthrough are also the ones warning about what it could mean. If that sounds like your kind of story, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next in this series. Let's get into it. To understand why 1,000 people wearing electrode caps is a genuinely big deal, you have to understand what modern AI is actually built from. Every large language model you have ever used, every chatbot, every image generator, was trained on indirect human output. Text that people typed, photos that people took, videos that people uploaded. All of it is a translation. A person has a thought. That thought gets filtered through language or through a camera lens, and only the filtered version ever reaches the model. The AI never sees the thought itself. It only ever sees the shadow the thought cast on the way out. For a long time, that was fine, because there was an almost bottomless well of human-generated text and images sitting on the internet, decades of it, free for the taking. But that well is running dry. Researchers at some of the largest AI labs in the world have warned that high-quality public text data could be effectively exhausted within just a few years, because the internet is not growing nearly as fast as the models that need to be fed by it. So the industry has started looking for entirely new categories of data. Video is one direction. Synthetic data generated by other AIs is another, riskier direction, because a model trained mostly on its own output tends to drift and degrade, the same way a photocopy of a photocopy gets blurrier every generation. But there is a third direction, one that almost nobody outside of specialized labs was taking seriously until recently. Skip the translation entirely. Read the electrical activity of the brain itself, while a person is thinking, feeling, or reacting, and hand that raw signal to the model instead of the text they eventually typed about it. That is not a small technical tweak. That is a fundamentally different category of training data, one that captures cognition before it gets compressed into words. And the reason nobody has done it at scale before comes down to one brutally simple problem. Brains are extremely hard to listen to. Electroencephalography, or EEG, has existed for almost a century. It works by placing electrodes on the scalp to pick up the tiny electrical voltages generated when neurons fire. It is cheap compared to other brain imaging methods. It is non-invasive, and it has been a staple of neuroscience labs and hospitals for generations. But if you have ever seen a real EEG session, you know it looks nothing like a product launch. It looks like a single person sitting very still in a quiet, shielded room, wearing a tight cap wired to a machine the size of a filing cabinet, trying not to blink too much because even eye movement shows up as noise in the signal. That setup can capture useful data from one brain, in one location, for one session. It cannot tell you anything about how 1,000 different brains respond to the same stimulus at the same moment, because getting even 2 EEG rigs to line up in time, down to the millisecond, across 2 different rooms, was already a serious engineering challenge. Multiply that by 1,000 people, spread across multiple cities, some online and some in person, and the problems compound fast. First, the hardware itself had to shrink. Lab-grade EEG caps are bulky, expensive, and need a technician to apply conductive gel to dozens of contact points, which is simply not something you can do for 1,000 people in a live event. Second, and far harder, is the timing problem. If you want to know how 1,000 brains react to the same second of video, you need every single device to be recording the exact same instant, aligned to a common clock. Network latency, the tiny delay in Wi-Fi and internet signals, makes this brutally difficult once you go beyond a handful of devices in the same room. A few milliseconds of drift between two people's data might not sound like much, but neural signals move fast enough that a delay that small can scramble the entire dataset, making it useless for training a model that depends on precise timing. For decades, this is exactly why brain data stayed small. Studies were built around 10 people, 20 people, maybe 50 in an ambitious case. Population-scale neuroscience, the kind of large, statistically powerful dataset that transformed fields like genomics once sequencing got cheap, never had its equivalent moment in neuroscience because nobody could solve the miniaturization problem and the synchronization problem at the same time. That is the wall a Chinese company called Shenwu Technology says it just broke through. In the summer of 2026, Shenwu Technology held a product launch built around a single, almost theatrical demonstration. The company's own team described it as neither a science fiction film set nor a staged marketing stunt, but a genuine on-site stress test of a system they call 1,000-person collective EEG. 1,000 participants, some physically present, some connected remotely from other locations, put on lightweight EEG devices at the same time. The system then recorded and aligned every single data stream, matching them together down to the millisecond, across every device and every region involved. Here's the part that changes everything. The breakthrough was not one single invention. It was two very different engineering problems solved together. The first was miniaturization without losing precision. The team had to shrink the electrode hardware down to something a normal person could put on themselves in seconds, without a technician and without gel, while still capturing a signal clean enough to be scientifically useful. The second was the timing problem, and this is the one that had stopped everyone before them. Achieving millisecond-level synchronization across a network, so that 1,000 separate devices in different cities all agreed on exactly when now was. State broadcaster CCTV covered the achievement directly, describing it as a major step forward, not just for brain-computer interfaces in general, but specifically for training what researchers are calling neural foundation large language models. That phrase is worth sitting with for a second. A neural foundation model is not trained on what people wrote or said about their thoughts. It is trained on the electrical signature of the thought itself, captured while it was happening. According to the research team behind the system, this is the real destination the technology is aimed at. A future where AI's learning material is no longer limited to indirect information like text, images, and video, but can directly access human cognitive states through neural signals. Shenwu built more than just the headsets. The company also unveiled what it calls a Neuro-AI collective cross-modal data platform, designed to support large-scale group EEG collection and real-time analysis, and to make that data reusable across the industry rather than locked inside a single lab's hard drive. In other words, this was not framed as a one-off demonstration. It was framed as infrastructure, the first piece of a pipeline meant to turn collective brain data into a standard input for training future AI systems. The same way scraped web text became the standard input for the last generation of language models. A demonstration is easy to dismiss. 1,000 people in electrode caps for one afternoon proves the hardware works, but it does not prove the technology is going anywhere. So here is the proof that this is not an isolated stunt, but part of a much larger, funded, government-backed push. Brain-computer interface technology was explicitly designated a future industry in China's government work report this year, and it was written directly into the outline of the country's 15th five-year plan, the Central Economic Blueprint covering 2026 through 2030. That is not a minor mention. Being named in the five-year plan puts BCI in the same strategic category as other technologies the state has decided to actively cultivate into new growth engines. And the money is already following the policy. In just the first half of 2026, there were 65 separate investment and financing deals in China's domestic brain-computer interface sector, adding up to roughly 72.53 billion yuan, which works out to somewhere around $10 billion US, flowing into this single field in 6 months. This is not confined to healthy volunteers wearing non-invasive caps at a product launch either. The same wave of investment is funding far more advanced, invasive systems already being used in real patients. In Nanchang, in Jiangxi province, a former art teacher named Deng, who lost the use of his hand in an accident, has chips implanted on the surface of his brain, made by a company called NeuroXes. Using those implants, he can lift chess pieces with a robotic exoskeleton glove controlled directly by his neural signals. Roughly 800 kilometers away in Shanghai, a man named Zhang, paralyzed from the shoulders down, has a matching implant. In a demonstration that made headlines earlier this year, the two men played a live game of chess against each other. Zhang directing a robot purely by thought, Deng moving physical pieces with his mind-controlled glove, with 800 kilometers of distance and two separate cities between them. On the hardware side, Chinese firms are pushing the raw channel count of these chips into territory that would have sounded absurd a few years ago. NeuroXes has developed a multi-channel EEG acquisition chip, built to process signals from tens of thousands of electrodes at once. A company called Wuhan Zhonghua Brain-Computer Integration Technology Development claims to have built a 65,000-channel bidirectional interface chip, compared to a mainstream industry standard closer to 3,000 channels, more than 20 times the resolution most systems in the world are currently working with. Government research infrastructure is scaling up to match. The Beijing municipal government is funding the Chinese Institute for Brain Research, with close to $29 million in its first year alone, rising to a planned $65 million annually going forward. In Shanghai, the Institute for Neuroscience is building out an international primate research center designed to house as many as 6,000 non-human primates for BCI and neuroscience research. And the clinical rollout is not staying confined to major coastal cities. In July 2026, the first high-altitude brain-computer interface clinical application center in China opened at Laos People's Hospital in the Zhejiang Autonomous Region, extending BCI treatment into one of the most physically demanding environments on Earth for both patients and equipment. Put all of that together, the 1,000-person EEG demonstration, the tens of billions of yuan investment wave, the 65,000 channel chips, the National Research Institutes, the cross-country chess game played entirely by thought, and a clear pattern emerges. This is not a lab curiosity. This is an industrial build-out, following the exact same playbook China has used before with batteries, solar panels, and electric vehicles. Identify a frontier technology early, name it a national priority, and pour in enough capital and coordinated policy support to compress a decade of normal development into a few years. But here's the honest part of this story. Because a technology this powerful does not come without real, specific limits that are worth taking seriously. Start with the basic science. Non-invasive EEG, the kind 1,000 people wore at that product launch, reads electrical activity through the skull and scalp, which acts like a blurry filter. It can detect broad patterns of brain activity, attention, arousal, certain kinds of recognitions, but it cannot cleanly decode specific words or detailed images the way a movie about mind reading might suggest. The far higher resolution systems, like the 65,000 channel implants from Wuhan Zhonghua, or the chips behind the cross-city chess game, require actual surgery to place electrodes on or in the brain, which is a real medical procedure with real risks, not something that scales to 1,000 casual volunteers at a conference. So there is an honest gap between the low-resolution, easy-to-deploy version of this technology and the high-resolution, invasive version that can genuinely decode fine-grained intent. Closing that gap, cheaply and safely, at scale, is still an open engineering problem, not a solved one. Then there is the question the researchers themselves are already raising. If the explicit long-term goal is training AI models directly on human neural signals, that raises a category of privacy concern that is different in kind, not just in degree, from anything text or image data ever created. A scraped tweet reveals what someone chose to say. A raw EEG signal, even an imperfect one, reveals something closer to how someone's brain was actually responding, in real time, whether they intended to reveal that or not. China's own government has acknowledged BCI needs dedicated attention as a frontier technology precisely because of this, folding it into national planning, rather than leaving it entirely to private companies. But regulation for neural data privacy, informed consent standards for large-scale collective EEG collection, and rules around who owns and can reuse this kind of information are all still being written in real time. In China and everywhere else this research is happening. None of this erases what the engineering has already proven. 1,000 brains really were read simultaneously, across cities, aligned to the millisecond. A paralyzed man in Shanghai really did direct a robot with his thoughts to play chess against a man 800 kilometers away. Tens of billions of yuan really are flowing into this sector every 6 months. It simply marks the distance between a genuine hardware and infrastructure breakthrough, which this clearly is, and a fully mature, ethically settled industry, which this clearly is not yet. Here is something that puts all of this in perspective. The United States has its own famous brain-computer interface story, and it has almost nothing to do with data at scale. When most people in the West hear the phrase brain-computer interface, they think of Neuralink, the company that has implanted chips in a small number of human patients, allowing them to control a cursor or play video games with their thoughts, one patient at a time, in a slow, carefully controlled trial process. That work is genuinely impressive, and it moves cautiously for good reason, because implanting hardware directly into a human skull is about as high stakes as medical technology gets. But it is fundamentally a story about depth, a handful of patients wired up with extraordinary precision. What China is now demonstrating is a story about breadth, 1,000 people wired up at once, at a product launch, with the explicit goal of generating training data at industrial scale, rather than treating a small number of individual patients. Those are not competing versions of the same technology. They are two different bets on where the real value of brain-computer interfaces will eventually come from. The American model bets that the breakthrough comes from perfecting the interface for one patient at a time, building trust, safety data, and precision before scaling anything up. The Chinese model, backed by that 72.53 billion yuan in 6 months, by national 5-year plan status, and by state broadcaster coverage framing this explicitly as AI training infrastructure, is betting that scale itself is the breakthrough, that the real value only shows up once you have thousands, then millions, of brains contributing data to a shared system. Neither bet has definitively won yet. Non-invasive EEG data from 1,000 people at a product launch is nowhere near as information-dense as a 65,000-channel implant reading one patient's brain directly. But data at scale has a way of compounding what individual precision alone cannot match. The same way a rough model trained on the entire internet eventually outperformed far more sophisticated systems trained on small, carefully curated datasets. If that pattern holds for neural data the way it held for text, then the country that figures out how to collect brain signals from the most people, cheaply, safely, and repeatedly, may end up with an advantage that is very hard to close later, regardless of who has the more elegant single implant today. That is the quiet, unglamorous race actually happening behind the headlines about chess games and product launches. And right now, China is the only country that has publicly proven it can synchronize 1,000 brains in a single afternoon. For as long as artificial intelligence has existed, it has been fundamentally an outsider to human thought, learning only from the traces we leave behind, the words we choose to type, the photos we choose to take. What happened in that room in China this year is a small but real crack in that boundary. Not a full breach, not mind reading in the way science fiction imagines it, but the first working proof that human cognitive signal can be captured, synchronized, and pooled at a scale large enough to matter, 1,000 people at once, across a country, on command. China has made clear this is not a side project. It is written into the 5-year plan. It is backed by tens of billions of yuan in fresh investment every 6 months, and it is already producing real clinical miracles, like 2 paralyzed men playing chess by thought alone across 800 kilometers of distance. The rest of the world is watching closely, partly in admiration and partly in concern, because the same infrastructure that helps a man move a chess piece with his mind is also, by design, infrastructure for training AI on the raw electrical texture of human thought itself. That is either one of the most hopeful medical stories of the decade, or one of the more unsettling ones, and honestly, it might be both at the same time. So here's the question worth sitting with. Once AI can learn directly from what your brain is doing, and not just from what you chose to say out loud, where exactly do you think the line should be drawn between helping people like Deng and Zhang reclaim their independence, and building a system that was never meant to look this closely at anyone's mind in the first place? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if this kind of deep, number-driven breakdown of what's actually happening in China's tech industry is something you want more of, subscribe, because this story is only getting started.